Just to let you know a little bit of the lay of the land today, what's coming up on the program. First of all, I'd like to mention Ken Menzel. I believe it's Ken dropping by today from the Twin Falls County Sheriff's Department, going to talk to us about some public safety issues. That's on the way in about 20 minutes, 23 minutes, we'll say. It's coming up on 8:07:44 at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story. I want to thank you much for joining us on this lovely Thursday morning. It's a beautiful start to the day. Was outside just a few minutes ago checking it out, and you can't complain about it whatsoever. And the weather forecast over the next several days is pretty much more of the same. And it's not humid. It's nice and dry in the air, but the warm temperatures, they just feel absolutely. Yesterday I sat watching baseball with the windows open and the wind blowing through the house, and I'll tell you what, there's nothing better in this world. Some of the other things that we're going to be talking about, if we get to it, there's a couple of things that we need to mention about faith and culture. There was a little sidelight at the Supreme Court the other day during the arguments about same-sex marriage, a little sidelight that took place during the overall arguments, and it could impact the tax-exempt status of churches and church-run institutions, hospitals and schools and the like in this country, if there is a ruling about this case involving same-sex marriage. So that will, if we get an opportunity, I hope to talk about that in the next hour as well, because it's going to impact a great deal of, you don't even see a lot of these things happening in your life, but it's going to impact a great deal of just activities in your everyday life and services that you may receive. Also, I wanted to mention right off the top of the program, before we move too far along, there is a special session of the Idaho State Legislature. It'll be coming up on May 18th, called by Governor Otter yesterday. I don't know why you had to call a news conference to announce that you were going to have a special session. He may have been able just to do this, issue a release from his office and notify legislators in another form. I think the reason there was a news conference called was because of all of the national attention Idaho has been getting, not just on this child support bill issue, but on a number of issues lately. Randy Staples had told us a few weeks ago that many Idaho legislators had made news not only nationally this year, but internationally, and not always for good reasons. The thing is that the mainstream media, when you have the Washington Post and the New York Times coming to Idaho, kicking down doors, they're only highlighting maybe one minor argument, as I pointed out yesterday, that had been made by legislators. And we have a handful of legislators who are concerned about creeping Sharia law. In fact, we're going to have a guest with us tomorrow named Brigitte Gabriel. You may know her from her appearances on Fox News, and she has been all over the country over the last 20 years or so talking about her experiences growing up in Beirut, Lebanon, when that city fell to the Muslims, and exactly what happened, the tortuous things that happened there, and how she escaped, and warnings for the rest of the world, because she's coming to speak next week in Idaho. You have people who are telling us right now that that's a concern, but there aren't many. And when establishment and national and international media make that the focus of the story, they're not telling people the entire truth about the state of Idaho. On the other hand, Governor Otter is put in a pinch. He's between a rock and a hard place, because he's got people hammering on his office door with questions about all of this, and he just wants it to go away, obviously. There was a more legitimate concern, much more legitimate concern among legislators who were opposed, and it was not even the full legislature. It was a committee, and it was a one-vote differential that prevented this bill from moving on to the entire legislature for approval. A one-vote differential, a 9-8 vote in a committee. So we're not talking about this being reflective of the entire legislature, and certainly not the entire state of Idaho. But some of these people in the legislature, I think, have very valid concerns about state sovereignty. This has been an issue that has been growing in importance over the past decade. It has everything to do with the federal government coming in. A friend of mine told me last night on the telephone, he is a lawyer, and he has been involved, he's an elected politician too, as well, back east. In fact, he has a signature on a marriage license because his office was charged with handling this one same-sex marriage from Ohio that was used in the arguments in the Supreme Court the other day about same-sex marriage. He was telling me the other day on the telephone, in fact, last night, he was saying that we go all the way back to Republican administrations with Elizabeth Dole when she was running the Transportation Department in the 1980s. When Ronald Reagan was the president, she was the Transportation Secretary. And she won a court case that said if you take federal money, and that would be from her department for road maintenance, then you're going to have to follow certain federal rules. You take Caesar's coin, you got to obey Caesar. And this is a bigger issue. Now, on the child support issue, what's happening is mainstream media is looking at this. And all mainstream media is doing is simply saying, oh, this poor woman in Pocatello may not get her child support because her husband ran off to Bulgaria. And that's all they're seeing. That's the narrow little view they have. But they're not seeing the larger concern that people, especially in the western states, have about federal control. When you have 2/3 of this state owned by the federal government, 3/4 of neighboring Nevada owned by the federal government, and it's not much better in Montana, Wyoming, and Utah, Colorado, and some of our other neighboring states, you understand why legislators might have some concerns about the overall arc of this. And so therefore, that's what they're talking about, and that's what the establishment media happens to be missing in all of this. Or they're not reporting it because they don't see it as a big deal. Big brother to them? Well, they believe in the nanny state, and they think that anyone who doesn't, something is wrong with us. But on May 18th, they will be back in Boise to discuss this and likely vote on it to approve it. The governor's concern is a loss of $43 million. Yes, the carrot and stick approach. The government wants you to go ahead and approve this. In order to do it, they offer you this this $43 million grant. And that in itself will help with the state budgeting process, as we all understand. $43 million is no small throw to any of us, and not even to state government in a smaller state like this. So that'll be done. I don't know if they'll work any other legislation. It's a one-day session, so my guess is there's not really going to be a lot more going on, and everything else that didn't get worked this particular winter and spring will come back again sometime next year. 14 minutes now after 8 o'clock. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX. 45. I mentioned being outside a few minutes ago because there was no breeze this morning. It actually feels already much warmer. Where yesterday morning it was pretty outside, but it felt quite a bit chillier. I went for a walk yesterday afternoon a couple of times. The breeze came through. I thought I was going to blow away. Luckily, I'm large enough that I'm pretty well anchored to the terra firma where my feet meet the ground, and so that was not an issue. A couple of other notes. I think that these are also applicable to some of the issues we deal with in the western states and also related to wind. I saw something today at the Daily Signal, which is a publication I signed up for. I get in my email every day, provided, I believe, by the Heritage Foundation ultimately. Time to end the production tax credit once and for all. Now, a lot of our legislators who will be going to this special session from this part of Idaho will be driving to Boise, and as they do it, they'll be driving by a lot of wind farms. What are wind farms? Well, when we talk about politicians, I'm sure you think flatulence, but no, in this case, we're talking about those giant pinwheels that are spinning around out there on the hilltops, and you see them pretty much everywhere all over western states. I started seeing them in Iowa driving out here, and they multiplied through Nebraska and Wyoming and Utah, and then finally into Idaho. Well, there is something called a production tax credit. And the Daily Signal, which is a conservative publication, is calling for an end to the production tax credit for the windmill business. I don't know if you've heard this or not, but I wanted to pass this along quickly if I could. Again, it's one of these federal programs designed by somebody far, far away that only costs you in the long run. And in this case, not sovereignty, this costs you money. The writer says common sense that a mature and self-sufficient wind industry should no longer be paid for by the American taxpayer, but common sense is a rare commodity in Washington, and it becomes even scarcer when the special interest spigot has been opened. You're not aware of this, but what's happening is this windmill industry, along with a lot of these other highfalutin alternative energy sources that have not yet produced, they're getting massive tax breaks. Well, first of all, a lot of them already had lots of government assistance as well. Atop that, they get tax breaks. So it's very profitable, even if you don't deliver. But then again, most of these people are Democrats, and the idea is to make sure that you line their pockets because they'll line your campaign coffers when you run again for office. The wind industry is now larger, the writer says, than ever, and so its influence on Capitol Hill. And with the growth in the wind industry's lobbying have come perpetual increases in the price tag for the production tax credit. Last year, it cost taxpayers $1.5 billion. This year, it has jumped to $2.8 billion. It is nearly doubled in a year. Next year, $3.5 billion. And that's an estimate at the moment, but you can see what's happening here. There's an exponential growth in all of this. It's allowing these people to put up these windmills, and they really don't have to pay any taxes on them any longer while they do it. The PTC also fosters vast market distortion and even puts the environment at risk. The credit pays out per kilowatt hour of energy produced. Now that means the more energy you generate, the more that you make, the money you make, regardless of actual energy demand. Wind power generators looking to milk the credit for all it's worth are going to generate as much wind energy as possible. So, and you may not even be using it, but they're going to ka-ching, ka-ching. Everybody's getting paid at the top in that situation. Well, not at the top. They're not actually sitting up there, although it would be interesting to take some of these actual liberal politicians who've been feeding all of this and maybe have them as a stunt sit atop some of these giant pinwheels out there on the prairie and on the mountaintops. And just tell them to spend a few days there, and then when they come down, see if they've come to their senses. Hey, anything at this point I think happens to be worth a try if it's going to reduce government spending. A government continues to go along and just print out money. There seems to be a view, I think mainly among the leftist classes, that you've got a printing press. You just keep printing the money up, and they don't understand that it has to be backed by something. We don't do it by gold anymore. It's called full faith in credit. Well, that means people around the world are being told, just put your faith in the United States government, which is $18 trillion officially in debt. So you see how this is becoming more and more difficult. But Lefty doesn't understand that because Lefty probably can't even manage his own household, much less try and manage the country. And so you've got this quandary they've put us in where they just continue to roll off the money off the printing press and hand it to people that they like, with the belief that if you want more money, you just print more. And somehow you don't dilute the value of it. And that you don't upset or offend your creditors, some of whom are not very nice people. You realize that. It's a bit like when you're dealing with the communist Chinese and some of these Islamic republics, which have also, they hold quite a bit of our debt too as well. It's a bit like dealing with a local neighborhood loan shark. And at the moment, we're able to hold them off. They're at arm's length. But eventually, when the loan shark doesn't get paid, the loan shark comes by with a few thugs and they break your legs. Now, the United States right now might be able to break a few legs back. But the fact of the matter is, do we really want to get into that fight? And I think that most people would argue and say, no, that's not exactly what we have in mind. 20 after 8 o'clock right now. In fact, 45 at our studio still. Not much of a change there. We have a lot going on this morning in the way of discussion coming up in just about 10 minutes. 10, 15 minutes. Ken Menzel will join us. Ken, or therefore some substitute, actually, as we had last week, or substitutes. Actually, the heavy artillery from the Sheriff's Department came in last week. Ken will be back this week. He was involved in a training exercise last week, and he will be dropping by. I'm going to bet in about 15 minutes. Right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning. Hope you can stick around. Got a couple of points to make after I was looking at the Associated Press wire this morning. I've never actually had a plate full of bear. I've got a couple of comments about that coming up in just a couple of minutes. 824, Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. And of course, we have some wonderful folks who make this program possible on a daily basis. Western States Bus Services hiring part-time bus drivers right now. I've mentioned this before. They will train people. And what they'll do is they'll pay you while they're training you as well. So your training is not something that you have to worry about picking up the tab for. They have split shifts, 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled on school days. That would mean when we have a big snow day or something along those lines. The pay is $10.75 per hour. You can apply today by contacting 733-8003. I had a little bit of tickle in my throat. Can I repeat that? Sure I can. 733-8003. Like having those conversations with myself. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Also, our good friends from Trip Family Medicine. I want to mention them again today. They were in the studio with us yesterday talking about bacteria, antibiotics, and the fact that in many cases these things have been overused. Well, next week between 8:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning, Dr. Tripp mentioned it yesterday, they're going to talk about silent killers. Now, what might those be? You can see someone walking down the street. Have you seen that commercial where you see the guys walking along at the workout club and they tell you that the one has high cholesterol, but he looks fine? So you can walk around and you can think that you're doing fine and everything else, but you may have something that's going on inside of you, and it could be the one thing that just someday drops you dead. So that's why they recommend you get checked on every now and then. We'll be discussing an issue along those lines coming up next week. You can tune in each Wednesday at 8:30 a.m. for Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine. Now, they're located right here in Twin Falls. You can find them on Fillmore. That's directly across the street from the main post office. And as they like to say, life's too short not to feel good. There is a hearing coming up, to my knowledge. I don't know quite how to put this otherwise. I believe it's just getting some public input. This is coming up, and it's going to be about bears in Colley, Wyoming. And is that in Wyoming? I guess it is. It's named after the famous Buffalo Bill, right? As far as using his name with all of this. A grizzly bear committee will discuss the a grizzly bear committee. Yeah, they're going to have a lot of big brown furry things sitting around a table, sipping coffee and eating bagels. And, they just it's like a lot of these committees I've been to anyway, where all the communication is just simply in grunts. A grizzly bear committee will discuss the possibility of removing the Yellowstone region animals from the endangered species list at an upcoming meeting in Colley. Now, actually, if the Bears were holding this meeting, I don't think that they would approve of that. The Colley Enterprise reports that the Yellowstone Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee I don't know where they come up with these names. Yellowstone Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. It's almost Soviet Union, isn't it? Yellowstone Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee. How do you print that on a business card? Well, you have to get an extra wide one, that's for sure, or you have to use two. They'll take up the issue Thursday and Friday. The 23-agency consortium, 23 agencies involved in this, of local, state, and federal governments, in other words, a lot of bureaucrats and a lot of redundancy. They will also be joined by regional Indian tribes who say that the Yellowstone grizzlies have recovered. Recovered from what? Were they out late on New Year's Eve? During the two-day conference, the committee will take public comments and hold presentations about population health and interaction within the 28,000 square mile Yellowstone ecosystem. The grizzly bear, I have an apartment that I live in downtown. That's called that's my ecosystem. The grizzly bear was listed as threatened species by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1975. Representatives from that agency are expected to attend the Colley meeting. So for 40 years now, we've had that designation. I had a school teacher of mine when I was a teenager, and he went bear hunting and came back one time, and we were asking him about his experience, and he said, well, I think bear meat's awfully tough. But other than that, I think he found it delicious. And I don't know, they are big, rather large, shaggy animals. On the other hand, they've got a lot of grizzle on them. That's probably why they're called grizzlies. And they might be easy to chew, I suppose. You might have to take one of those tenderizing hammers and pound on them a little bit. But don't do that when they're still alive, because if you do that when they're still alive, they tend to get a little cantankerous. And I'm told that the grizzly bear is not the friendliest of creatures when you offend it. We have one other quick environmental note this morning. Federal officials have announced more than $4 million in projects in 4 states. How can you get a hold of this money? I mean, can someone tell me how I can get my hands on some of this? In 4 states, as part of a wildlife fighting strategy to protect a wide swath of Intermountain West sagebrush country that supports cattle ranching and is home to a struggling bird species. Yes, a struggling bird species having a very difficult time meeting its utility bills as well as its mortgage payment. Interior Secretary Sally Jewell said Wednesday that the U.S. Bureau of Land Management will use the money in Idaho, Utah, Nevada, and Oregon to counter wildlife threats, invasive grasses, and juniper trees encroaching in sagebrush habitat. When the founders of this country sat down and got together to come up with with what we have, I know they all sat down and said, the first thing we need to do is we need to have a strategy that safeguards the greater sage-grouse bird while contending with fires that have especially been destructive in the Great Basin region. Yes, that's what they were saying. That we had to protect sagebrush country and struggling grasses and invasive grasses and sage-grouse and all of that. It's not? Oh, I thought perhaps it was, somewhere in Thomas Paine's writings. 8:30, Bill Colley with you. Hey, a little bit of law talk coming up in just a few minutes on News Radio 1310 KLIX. I have a Facebook link shared from a friend And she grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. And she says, and she's showing me this link that claims that there is evidence that outside protesters were bussed in to help whip up the crowd over the weekend and cause that riot on Monday that took place. Are any of us, are we surprised by that? Because we heard the same thing was coming out of Ferguson, Missouri when that place was going up in flames a few months ago. There's also a story out today, and even the Washington Post has picked this up. One of the other men who is being transported in the van, that is, taken in the van to the police department, along with this Freddie Gray, who ended up dead after having some of his spinal cord, what they said was just basically torn, 80% of it. This guy now says Gray was beating his head against the walls in the van. Well, I don't know about you, but if you take your head and start smashing it against some hard object, it could well be that it tears it off, or at least partially does it. So just like Ferguson, Missouri, where there were all these riots and you had liberals screaming and yelling and whipping people up into a frenzy, and then it turned out that the police officer was entirely justified. It was like, oops. Well, yeah, all right, we're sorry about a few $1 million in damage to some private citizens who had nothing to do with any of this. But gee willikers, police aren't very nice. Excuse me, don't use that excuse with us any longer. If the criminal is responsible for the criminal's own death, don't jump to conclusions, please. And that's what's happening again all over in one of America's largest cities. I think Baltimore is now the 21st or 22nd largest city in the United States. It's got a population a little over 600,000, somewhere in that particular range. Did you hear there is a news anchor at CNN? Her name is Brooke Baldwin. She's there mainly because she's got blonde hair and she's pretty. I don't know that there's a lot more that's going on in the top of her head. The elevator may not go to the top floor, not the sharpest tool in the shed, 2 beers short of a six-pack. Do I need to say much more? Brooke Baldwin was inferring on the air the other day that returning war veterans are becoming police officers, and that those returning veterans are then going out on the streets and treating it like war zones and brutalizing people. Well, it didn't go over well with a great many of America's war veterans who come home and lead peaceful lives. And guess who had to eat crow on the communist news network, that is CNN?
I gave credence to the idea that veterans returning from war who were police officers were furthering the problems in communities like these here in Baltimore and nationwide. And I just have to take a moment again today to say I was wrong. I was so wrong to speak the way I did involving our men and women in uniform to perpetuate this false narrative. It's on me, I own it, and I apologize. Please, let's move on.
Yes, let's move on. Now, I've saved my job, or I think so, and I'm not really sincere, but let's move on now. Okay, let's just forget about it, that I've besmirched everyone who went off to war and got shot up potentially and had their own lives threatened on a daily basis. And I had to go out and dodge bullets and IEDs and everything else along the roads of Afghanistan and Iraq. But let's now move on. I don't think this woman is going to be, the newest Jane Fonda. She ought to look back at history and see what happens when you besmirch the troops. And she can understand that from now on, she may well end up with what. I remember one time I walked into a friend's Legion post. We ran in on a Friday night to see his dad. His dad, by the way, is still, you want to talk about a guy his dad's about 88 or 89 years old. His dad still likes to go down to the local Legion post a few nights a week, smoke cigars at the bar, and drink beer. Hey, God bless him if he can do that and still be walking around at his age. But we went down to visit the American Legion post to say hi to his dad. And I went into the men's room, and a lot of people have seen these before, but they had Jane Fonda urinal targets. Do I need to say anything more? I think you understand exactly what I'm talking about, right? And you can get them in Barack Obama's image too as well, but you don't usually see those in Legion halls. Well, you might in some. But maybe this reporter now is going to have her own image in urinals all over America's VFW's, Legion halls, and AMVETS clubs. It would not surprise me if something like that were to happen at this point. 8:38, Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story. And I've got one other quick thing to note. There is a writer by the name of Stacey Patton, guest editorialist today at the Washington Post. You may be able to infer nothing by her name, but I will tell you that she is defined as they say in media, African American. And she says, "Why is America celebrating the beating of a black child? A mom's violence won't keep her son safe." This is another one of those liberals who think spanking is bad. And she's upset that the woman who went out and smacked her son, who, she didn't go out and just knock him down or anything like that. She swatted him once and then kicked him in the pants to get him to go home and maybe saved him from some serious physical harm or death or something along those lines. And she got her son home, and, the discipline, he was humiliated in front of his friends. He may not dare show his face again at the next riot, which will actually be better for his health too. But this woman says it's wrong. She says a mom beating her son, we should not appreciate that. And she says the only reason that white folks, the only reason that we enjoy seeing that video is because it's a black teenager getting smacked around. Apparently, the fact that it's his black mother doing it it goes right over our heads. We're just not as smart as American lefties. Got more details on that story coming up a bit later in the program. Bill Colley with you on Top Story this morning. And in fact, I've got a couple of Stephen A. Smith, who's a legendary sports announcer, has some very strong comments to make. He will not be getting invited to the next Liberal Club dinner. This woman who's writing at the Washington Post, her name again is Patton, no relation to the general, Stacey Patton. She has this comment. I was looking through this column. Now, if you want to know a little bit about this woman's background, it says that Stacey Patton is what says read more from her. It doesn't even give her biography. Usually you get someone's biography at the end of a column like this. It just says you can read more from her. And apparently she's written a couple of other similar diatribes over the course of the years. But listen to what she has to say. Quote, "This celebration of Graham," that's the woman all right, we'll break the quotes. "That's the woman who smacked her son. Reflects a belief that black youths are inherently problematic, criminal, and out of control. The video also supports the idea that black fathers are absent, suggesting that all we need is an angry black mom to beat the thug out of an angry young man, and everything will be fine." Can I share a thought on that very quickly? I'm looking at this. First of all, as I read up about this mother, Toya Graham, there is no father in the picture. She's trying to raise like 5 kids all on her own. This is her only son. So to sit here and say that this gives the impression, well, the impression is true. The dad isn't around anywhere. So the mom's just trying to make sure her son doesn't get killed. Like she said, we don't need another Freddie Gray. I don't want him to be one. So she dragged him home. And somehow she's wrong. I don't, the whole notion that liberals have is everybody here is a victim. And that we've just got to make sure that we get the victims as much room to riot and destroy as they can, apparently to make them feel better about themselves. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. You can reach us at 736-0300. We have a caller with us on Top Story. You're on the air.
Good morning. When I got back from Iraq, I noticed the difference from the East Coast to the West, not really the West Southern. I landed in Boston, Massachusetts, in uniform, coming back from overseas, and I got spit on. I took off from Boston, and I landed in Texas, at Dallas-Fort Worth, and we got the shower of affection from a fire truck as we pulled in the plane.
And no surprise whatsoever about any of those two stories. Well, we're dealing with people in media who just obviously, and a lot of them, thank you much for the call. And by the way, I want to thank him for his service. People in media, and I'll get to my next caller in just a moment, people in media, a great many of them who covered those wars have already moved on. There's a whole new group of these reporters working at these networks, because they try to hire, it's like show business. It is show business. They hire the young and the good looking, and they've already moved the older crowd out. So this woman who's rambling on CNN, obviously it's apparent she has no idea of what happened in those 2 war zones. You're up next. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story.
I'm pretty sure if I was looting and destroying things, my angry white mom would kick my little white butt, and she'd just warm me up for my father.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous that people. I'm only 30. I grew up when people started not spanking their kids, but my parents made it clear that you are to be respectful. You are not to break the law. And my parents are angels. I say my angry white mom, but she's an angel. But if we did something wrong, you were sure that she knew that it wasn't going to happen again.
And I think that, again, that goes back, thank you for the call, to what our previous caller was saying. We have a different culture in certain parts of the country than what you have on the East Coast. And much of the East Coast is especially just completely deranged. My own mother, she was the disciplinarian, and my dad just was the yeller. He'd shout a lot, which was bad enough. My mom, although she was only about 5 feet 1 inches tall, being a farm girl, was quite rugged. And I remember her being so angry with me one time, she took my dad's gun belt and smacked me across my bottom with it. And you know what? She could really get some force behind that. But by golly, she got my attention when she did it. And she raised 3 children, and most of her 3 children did pretty well in life. 2 school teachers, and unfortunately the black sheep became a radio talk show host. But the fact of the matter is, it was quite common when I grew up. You would know when somebody was in trouble in the neighborhood because you could hear the yelling and screaming and crying, and you knew who was getting whipped that particular day. Now, when we say whipped, the liberals say, oh my goodness, they were whipping their children. Oh, come on. We're talking about the fact that they got a paddling. And this woman walked out on the street, and she grabbed her son, and he reached out, so she swatted him aside the head. It's not like she was knocking him out or giving him a concussion. And then he turned around and she kicked him in the backside. I saw the video too as well. The writer says what is so disturbing is that white supremacy is let off the hook. This is the writer from the Washington Post. A militarized and racist police force is not the problem. Systemic racism, from the war on drugs to racial profiling, from hypersegregation to community divestment, is not the issue. The message becomes black children's behavior is the true enemy of peace. I said it on the air here last week one day. The famous high school principal, Joe Clark, they made a movie about this man's life. He took over a troubled school, I believe it was in Paterson, New Jersey. And he walked around the halls with a baseball bat to keep order. And you know what? He turned the school around. And I ran into him at an airport one day, and we were talking. And he told me I was kind of like trying to be nice about my inferences about inner city life. And he says, oh, don't give me that. Stop the politically correct stuff. You're talking about young black men, and young black men in this country are out of control. Now, that was 25 years ago. Do you think it's gotten any better? We've thrown how many billions, actually trillions of dollars now at America's cities, and it hasn't gotten any better. And none of these people in any way have been appreciative of anything that we've tried to do. And I guess that's because Lefty doesn't understand that just, throwing money at a problem, that there's a great deal more that has to be involved with all of this. Here's the details on this. The Washington Post is likely regretting having to even publish this. The Washington Times had picked it up. And the headline is, Prisoner in Van said Freddie Gray was trying to injure himself. Yes, he was beating his head against the walls of the van on his way to the police station. And as I said earlier, if that was what fractured his spine, then what did we have all of this burning and looting for on Monday? Well, the burning and looting had nothing to do with that. That's an entirely separate issue. These are people who wanted to go out and burn and loot. They didn't know the man. Most of them had no idea who he was until after he died. This was just their excuse to go out and do it. Stephen A. Smith, who is a sports announcer, he's got a radio talk show, I believe, too, as well. He works for ESPN. That's his main position. Now, ESPN is not happy with him. He's been suspended in the last couple of years, at least once, because of some of his opinions, because he's apparently, well, he's a conservative somewhat, and he's a black man. But he does not buy into all of this victimization that is constantly being peddled by a great many people in media and in his own community. Just a few weeks ago, he was giving a speech, and he said more black people should be voting Republican. He said, you sit around and complain about the Republican Party, but what do they owe you? You never vote for them in the first place. If you want their attention, go out in droves and vote for them. Promise that you'll be a good core for them, and then you'll get some responses. Well, he was talking during an interview yesterday with Skip Bayless, and he says he is not pleased by what he has seen with all of the rioting.
We have to understand the difference between police brutality and a brutal act by a particular police officer. When you say police brutality, what you're doing is you're inciting a nation of individuals out there to go and act in a very belligerent and, dare I say, criminal fashion against law enforcement officials.
Oh, criminal fashion. Now, you've already got the mayor of Baltimore apologizing for calling them thugs. The governor of Maryland has not apologized for calling them thugs, And the President of the United States has not apologized for calling them thugs. Again, this has nothing to do with mourning a dead man, who, by the way, was a career criminal. This is about discount shopping. And Stephen A. Smith understands that. Even President Obama understands that. The mayor of Baltimore apparently did for a few minutes and then apologized for having said it. You know, she's number 3 at the Democrat National Committee in Washington. You got Debbie Wasserman Schultz at number 1, and then there's somebody else in the middle, and then this Stephanie Rawlings Blake. I guess they all have to have hyphenated names. She's number 3. This is the leadership of the Democrat Party in this country that failed to call out the National Guard as the fires started and the looting started, and this is what we can expect if we have another 4 years in the White House of people like this. I think we can say that for sure. Smith, by the way, goes on to say, you cannot win a riot.
Where do you think that's going to get them? What do you think is going to happen to them? You really, really think that you can go up against law enforcement officials? First of all, you're wrong. And more importantly than anything else, you're not going to win.
Yeah, you know, even though you may have a lot of stolen firearms, some of these people anyway may have some of these things, instruments that they're using. The police have many, many more. And the police have better service when it comes to actually making sure these things are in working order. And the police have better body armor and better equipment and a few armored vehicles too as well. Whether you appreciate that or not, whether it's needed or not in many places, let's leave that open for an argument on another day. All Smith is saying is you're simply not going to win this battle if you think you're going to war with a local police department. And I think in this case, this fellow happens to be spot on. And then he also wrapped up with this. We need to have personal responsibility. Now, I'm sure he's going to end up with a lot of grief from his bosses at ESPN for saying this, and he's not going to be invited to many more liberal gang parties. But take a listen to what he has to say.
We're busy looking outside at everybody else, what everyone else has done to us, what history has done to us, how it has affected us, etc., etc. But guess what? I'm here to tell you something. I haven't heard this said, Skip, on the airwaves. Our ancestors, considering our history and what they had to go through and the sacrifices that they had to make to get us to this point, our ancestors will be ashamed.
And as he said that, there was a group in the background apparently listening. What they had was, you see this a lot on the ESPN college game day shows, where they'll put Kirk Herbstreit out there and Lee Corso and some of the other hosts of that program. They'll be sitting at a set, but that set is slightly upraised, and the crowd is allowed to stand out there like a live audience in the background. And wherever they were broadcasting from, I don't know if it was Baltimore or not, but wherever they were broadcasting from, there was a large crowd. And when he said that, our ancestors would be ashamed, and it was mainly a crowd filled with what they call people of color. They broke into applause, and you heard a great many of them saying that's right. So Lefty may not understand this, but a great many people who actually live in those communities, they don't want it burned down as well. They would prefer that everyone go home and that we wait for the law to come to some sort of determination about how this guy died during the course or following that arrest. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story. It's 46 at our studios. It's coming up on 8:56. If you'd like to reach the program, 736-0300, 736-0300. Now, there was a story that hit the internet a few days ago. And I've had an argument a couple of times on air with people about things they see on the internet and the veracity of those. There was a story that hit the internet a couple of days ago that said that this guy, Gray, had been in a car accident about a week before, and that he had had a spinal injury, and he had been told to stay home and rest, and instead he was out on the street dealing drugs, and that had led to his untimely death. I never mentioned that story on the air. I noticed Drudge skipped it. I noticed a lot of people in media didn't pick it up. And I was just a little suspicious of it, even though they provided what they said. There was a photograph of a court report. But as it turns out, it wasn't true. The court report is actually from a lawsuit that Gray and his sister filed about getting it was a lead poisoning lawsuit, that they had been poisoned by lead paint when they were kids in their neighborhood. And they had filed the lawsuit. And what happened was, in early April, they were supposed to show up in court. They didn't, so the judge dismissed the case. But we have to be wary of things that we see on the internet that purport to be true, because we have a lot of people out there who'll call you up and tell you that that we've got the black helicopters flying around, and they saw it on the internet. We've got a regular caller who does that sort of thing. And I've pointed out, you can't believe everything you see there. And the Baltimore Sun, I used to subscribe to that newspaper at one point because they had a great conservative columnist named Ron Smith, and he was actually a conservative talk show host in that city. He passed away from pancreatic cancer a couple of years ago, and I haven't renewed my subscription since then. But that newspaper did a records check and said that they could find nothing to back up that claim that Gray had been injured recently in a car accident. His father was in a car accident. His father has the same name, but that was 10 years ago. And then they went to the people who published this story originally and asked for a comment, and no one would return their telephone calls. And that story has now been taken down from the internet. That got circulated a lot, though. I had multiple emails from people telling me, well, you see, now we know how that guy died, and it was all his fault. It may have been his fault as far as the story about him banging his head in the police wagon, the paddy wagon, going to jail. But no, he was not involved in a car accident, suffering a spinal injury that he failed to look after. Coming up on news at 9 o'clock, Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. And we do have one more hour of the program ahead. Keep in mind, Rush Limbaugh will be along following news at 10 o'clock from the Fox Radio Network. Got a lot to talk about in the coming hours. Oh, there is a story my coworkers are telling me about some people trying to raise money to buy a drive-in. And they say you shouldn't trust them. If you were with us in the last hour of the show, I mentioned I had a chat with a lawyer friend last night on the telephone. We were actually talking about some baseball, but we got off on a couple of other topics because he serves in his county. It's called Clerk of the Peace at a county back east. It's an old colonial sort of office, but it's the same as Justice of the Peace, but he just covers an entire county versus a town or a city. And what he had done is his state has legalized same-sex marriage. A couple had showed up from Ohio, and one of the deputies in his office performed the marriage ceremony. He then had to sign off on it. It came by his desk. He had to write the certification or sign the certification, and it went on. And he said that certification with his signature was what was presented in one of the arguments on Tuesday at the Supreme Court. That he said, did you talk much about this story the last couple of days? And I said, no. I said, we have a lot more going on, and we were on the topic for a couple of days about Baltimore, Maryland, as well as we have a situation in Idaho that has that sprang up because of a lack of a vote on a bill for collecting child support from people overseas. So that's a big statewide story. So we didn't really spend a lot of time on the arguments before the Supreme Court in this particular case. But a couple of things. There's always some stuff on the sidelines that we don't get to on a daily basis. But some things caught my attention this morning, and I found that this was interesting. During the arguments Tuesday, this comes from Crisis Magazine. On Tuesday, Solicitor General Donald Verrilli Jr., whenever I hear his name, I always think there's either pasta or some sort of a venereal disease. He told the Supreme Court that religious colleges could lose their tax exemption and suffer other penalties if the court redefines marriage. Certainly, the writer says, this could affect evangelical Christian, Mormon, and other religious colleges as well as all religious apostolates that adhere to the natural definition of marriage. So it's pretty widespread. But Catholic education especially has been targeted by LGBT activists. In fact, that's happening in San Francisco, California, where they're calling for the removal of the archbishop because he insisted that his schools stick to biblical teaching versus Democrat Party teaching. So he's under fire because of that. And it also says that Congress has been asked to help and try and protect religious institutions in Washington, D.C., because the D.C. City Council has passed a new ordinance that would force institutions like these to provide all sorts of contraceptives and abortion insurance or paying for abortions for women, and they don't want to do it. Unfortunately, we increasingly see people of faith who are being marginalized into the sidelines. The only thing I can say that we really need to do, or what needs to happen in a situation like this, we need to wait until some of these people in these churches are called before a congressional committee, because we're headed that direction. Yes, I know Republicans control both houses, but you know, Republicans, if you're watching what the Republican presidential candidates are saying about all of these social issues right now, they're running as far away. They want to get on the bandwagon. They don't want to be seen or labeled in the media as being hateful. So they're suddenly on board with a lot of these changes in our culture that just a few years ago would have made a lot of them queasy. They would have had some issues with it. They would have been staunchly opposed to a lot of these things. Only a handful are now. Rick Santorum, but he's got no chance, snowball's chance, in Hades of actually becoming president. And in the House and Senate, you have a lot of people who, well, let's put it this way. When you see McConnell and Boehner, you immediately realize that that guy in Baltimore wasn't the only person without a spine. That we have people in politics who are walking around still living, and they have none. So you could see religious leaders who would refuse to do some of these things obviously end up being dragged in front of courts, being charged with contempt. They could end up being dragged in front of Congress for hearings. And I think what we need to do is we need to have religious leaders in those moments start saying, all right, tell you what, I'm refusing, take me to jail. But you know what will happen when you start filling the jails with ministers and priests? You're going to see somewhat of a backlash in this country. Just as you saw, you keep reading these polls. Well, the American people favor all of these changes, and the American people favor them more and more every year, as if we should be governed by polling data. But what happened in Indiana when they threatened the people who owned that pizza joint, some of the polls showed that the American public opinion started moving in the other direction again. So Americans don't like the fact that people who are, and a lot of Americans never go into a church other than a wedding or a funeral. But on the other hand, they still have some affinity for people who, they're nominally Christian, and they don't necessarily like it when other Christians are being oppressed by the government. We hear all of this talk about oppression of minorities in the big cities and oppression of women, and unfortunately, we never get to talk about the fact that people who actually believe in God. Justice Scalia made a comment the other day that has liberals just breathing fire. A protester was in the back of the court as they were in the middle of the hearings, and the protester jumped up and screamed that same-sex marriage was an abomination against the Lord. And he was dragged out of the building, and after he was dragged away, Scalia watched this all take place and then said, well, that was refreshing, and there was some laughter, but liberals are upset, saying, what does he mean that was refreshing? Do not the liberals understand that what the protester was shouting about is actually biblical? See, they don't know that. Lefty is completely illiterate on these issues. Lefty thinks you can just tear those pages out once you tell them that they actually exist and that you can still get by. And this is what we happen to be dealing with. But if you had clergy in large numbers and maybe some really big names, if you had a Franklin Graham and a Timothy Dolan, some of these people in this country who were willing to say, tell you what, we're not going to obey. We're going to keep our doors open. We're going to do things the way we've always done them according to God. And so be it if you drag us away to jail. There is precedent throughout history of something like that happening. If you start locking up all of these men, all of these holy men, can you imagine what's going to happen? The early Christians who were being eaten and mauled by lions in the Roman Colosseum and in other Roman circuses, they came in and they walked out into the middle of those arenas and people jeered them. But then as they were being mauled and they silently prayed in groups, people had an immediate reaction. And their perception of the Christians in the ring being devoured by these wild beasts, the perceptions changed. And the faith exploded then in its size because people started leaving these arenas and just shell-shocked by the fact that these people could remain so calm in the face of danger. And as they're walking home from these spectacles, they're talking amongst each other in whispers saying, there must be something to this. Well, that's why you would see these people go off and be willing to surrender themselves and go into the deepest, darkest holes of the American prison system in order to make a point. And we're going to have to do that. We're getting there. But we need people who are willing to stand up and make that first move. And unfortunately, that always seems to be the most difficult thing that we've got going on, is to convince people someone has to be the leader. 736-0300, the people who tell you that they'd like to be your leader, normally you don't want them to be your leader. That's been my experience in life. Well, I'd like to be the leader for my own personal aggrandizement. That's what often happens. The real leaders are the people who just suddenly one day say, I've had enough. I'm not going to take it anymore. And they go forward, and all of a sudden they discover that a lot of other people feel the same way they do. That's what we really need in America today. We're not finding it in the political class, but I think we can find it elsewhere. Also, the woman in Washington State, you may remember this story. We've got a number of these going on around the country now. Arlene's Flowers appeals to state Supreme Court. A Richland flower shop owner sued over her refusal to provide services for a same-sex wedding because of her religious beliefs, wants the state Supreme Court to review the case. It was a county judge that actually ruled that she broke the law when she told a longtime customer in March 2013 that she couldn't provide services for his wedding because of her religious beliefs. She, by the way, is a Christian from the Southern Baptist tradition, which is, believe me, Southern Baptists are very biblical people. They are very, very Bible-based. And to sit here and say, well, you can, that's not important. That's what the judge is saying. That's not important that you believe in that. You hurt these guys' feelings, so therefore, you're going to have to pay a fine or go to jail or something along those lines. God bless that woman for actually taking a stand and at least being able to try and fight it beyond this, because a lot of these small business people simply don't have the wherewithal or the means to do that. It's 9:16. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 48 at our studios, and our telephone number is 736-0300. In Kentucky this week, there was a bit of a change-up. A judge in Kentucky actually sided with the business that refused to comply with the request. And the judge said, on the basis that these people have freedom of religion in this country, I am not going to force them, fine them, or jail them to do business, because they wouldn't do business with these people whose lifestyles they cannot abide by because of what they've been taught from the time that they were probably in the cradle in many, many cases. You can reach our show today a couple of different ways. Email, I believe, happens to be a simple way, especially for the shy people out there. You can drop me a line at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. Bill.Colley, last name is spelled Colley, at townsquaremedia.com. Or you can give me a telephone call at 736-0300. That is 736-0300. And in another small victory, Kentucky not being the only one, but in another small victory, the Daily Signal reporting today, caving to conservative pressure, the Republican leadership is agreeing to hold a vote to protect religious freedom in Washington, D.C. After facing pressure from conservative lawmakers, House leadership, that would be John Boehner and his ilk, has agreed to hold a vote on a measure that could strike down a Washington, D.C. anti-discrimination law that opponents say infringes on the ability of organizations to operate in accordance with their religious beliefs. The controversy surrounds a law called the Reproductive Health Non-Discrimination Act. Again, another one of these Soviet sort of Orwellian titles for one of these laws, which ensures that, quote, individuals are protected from discrimination by an employer, employment agency, or labor organization based on an individual's or dependent's reproductive health decisions, unquote. Timothy Dolan, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, he is the Roman Catholic Archbishop of New York. Timothy Dolan has said they treat pregnancy as if it's an illness. You're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Yeah, I'm an ultra-conservative. If somebody wants to do something in their bedroom, I think it's nobody's business. The problem is these people they not only want us to allow them their same-sex marriages, they want us to embrace it.
Sure, they want your involvement. Bring them out so we may know them. They want you to come over and actually crawl into the bedroom with, as you say, they can do whatever they please, but they want you to come over and actually join in.
Exactly. And, therein lies the problem. If somebody wants to live that lifestyle, beat your head against the wall, go ahead. But I'm not going to be involved in it. I'm not going to embrace it.
You've got a lot of people out there, and I thank you for the call, who probably deep down in know from their own upbringing, they have some doubts about their lifestyle. And I'm sure that because of those doubts, have some fears that they may be going to hell. And they know they would be lonely in hell, so they think you ought to go along with them in order to keep them company. But unfortunately, there are those of us who don't want to spend eternity there, and it's nothing personal. But frankly, I cannot do that. And I think that's a fairly simple argument that courts and the left just can't seem to understand. We've got more coming up, more of your telephone calls too as well. I know there's some people who'd like to get through. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX. I just want to pass along very, very quickly. One of my coworkers here in the building, Nate Bird, took some photographs of the new playground at the soccer complex last night. I'm looking this over. You know, for a man who's 52, almost 53 years old, I don't often go around thinking, gee, I wish I was a kid again, but no playground that I ever went to ever had, this is beautiful. The amenities, a rock climbing wall, and some of the other interesting toys that now exist. We didn't have a lot of plastics, of course, that were used in playground construction when I was a kid. Up behind my school, we had a thing that looked like the capsule on top of a Saturn V rocket, or maybe a Mercury rocket. And those were the monkey bars. They were, metal, and you could climb up them. And then in the middle there were 4 or 5 poles. This was back when the Batman TV show was really, really big. So what we would do is we would pretend that we were Batman and climb up the side of this thing and then leap out and jump on those poles and then slide down. When they seem to be like just forever. When you're a little kid, of course, that looks really large. And I remember being an adult and walking by. The school had been sold and it had become a senior center, but not that the seniors were out there using any of the playground equipment to my knowledge, but no one had removed it. And I went walking through the old playground, and that old thing was still out there. The problem was those metal poles, when you would slide down them, we used to actually get slivers out of the metal. I kid you not, in our palms of our hands, and we'd go into our classrooms and our teachers would get the twisters out and tweezers, and they would take the slivers out of our hands. Which could be quite painful, but no one ended up dying or anything like that. And we didn't have any of that soft ground beneath it. If you fell while you were trying to leap out and grab those poles, you fell right down on the asphalt. And one of my buddies actually broke an arm that way one day. I know it's not funny, but when you think about it, we were a tough lot compared to the kids today. But this new playground is stunningly beautiful. Bill Colley with you this morning on News Radio 1310 and newsradio1310.com. That means you can listen to us online anywhere, all over the world. There's a little icon there that says Listen Live. Click on that, and you'll be able to hear us. So if you're out of town, vacation or business, or just for some other reason, not quite sure what the other reason would be, but whatever you're doing and you're away, you can click on and catch up with what's going on back home by doing that. Newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story, and you can reach our program by dialing 736-0300. That is 736-0300. We have another caller with us, and you're on the air on Top Story.
Hey, good morning, Bill. In your last segment, you spoke about faith and thought leaders taking positions now and speaking out, and that's already started. There is a call for civil disobedience should the Supreme Court make a decision that affects the entire United States. And currently there is a website, defendmarriage.org, that has 25,000 signatures. And I looked through that this morning, and a lot of the faith and thought leaders that you mentioned, and many more, have already signed onto this, to include, for example, Reverend Franklin Graham. And so this is happening. And I think, for me, part of it is because Christians have discovered what can occur in this country when you allow the federal government to move forward with something like no prayer in schools. And now, 40 or almost 50 years later, we're looking back and seeing the impact that this has had. And there really was no strong outburst regarding it. I mean, I grew up in Twin Falls, and I went to Lutheran school here. And so that wasn't talked about at my table, no prayer in schools, because we continued to pray in school.
Oh, sure.
And it wasn't a deal. But now looking back and remembering when all of this was happening, even though I was a young boy, it's evident to me that when we allow the federal government to move into areas of our lives that are so significant, such as our faith, that the federal government will just steamroll. And so what's happening, or what happened yesterday in the Supreme Court, is very important. And we Christians should not be lulled into a false sense of security by many of the issues that were raised yesterday, particularly by Justice Kennedy and Justice Alito and Justice Scalia. They made important points, but so much happens behind closed doors, and I think that we should be prepared to move forward with what our faith tells us and what our Lord tells us is the right movement ahead. And I thank you very much for the time.
Sure, and I thank you for the call. He mentioned Franklin Graham. We had been mentioning him in the last segment of the program, too. Franklin Graham, no different than his dad when it comes to how he preaches the faith. There's no difference whatsoever. Let's just tell you how far culture has moved, though. His dad is viewed as an American icon. A friend of mine who's a Wesleyan used to tell me that Billy Graham, if there was a Protestant pope, that's the guy. And he just absolutely revered. The son, who is no different than his father when it comes to his doctrinal beliefs and what he talks about, his son is reviled by the American left. And a great many people, even possibly on the right. How does that happen? And the caller also made another point. You heard some questioning by some of the justices, which might give you some hope that they'll say no. But I remember the argument over Obamacare. After hearing the arguments, we all thought, oh, this is a slam dunk. And the result was entirely different. That's a serious concern. But what's our plan B? Because you're not going to raise the white flag and say that's it, it's over. You have other options. And massive civil disobedience, there's just simply no way they can lock all of us up. Hillary Clinton saying we should let people out of prison, all the felons out early anyway, so they can go down to Baltimore, I guess, and riot. But they don't have room for all of us. It's too expensive. That's what they're saying. So this might be the next direction. 9:30, Bill Colley with you. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. There is an actual political party operating in North Carolina. It's called Christian Party of North Carolina. And I'm on Facebook. Well, I'm not a friend, I guess. You hit the like button and you can actually get details about what they're involved with. But I'm on the mailing list from Don Watson. He drops me his daily emails at my Yahoo account. He's the fellow who put that together. And in North Carolina, let's face it, that maybe not quite what was called the Bible Belt. It's North Carolina is a big enough state where it's got like 3 separate cultures. But I think people there are still in Raleigh-Durham because of in Chapel Hill, you've got a lot of liberals who've settled in those areas. But if you get out into North Carolina, into the hills and the smaller communities, it's an entirely different story. It's the old culture, the old Tidewater culture, where these people very much haven't changed in their belief systems for 300-400 years. And he's got an email today where he lists all of the different activities they're involved with. I believe that we will start seeing more and more political parties of the same, using the same name, if you will. And these Christian parties will start popping up across the country. You already have parties in Europe that identify themselves as Christian. Now, in many cases, in places like Germany, Christian Democrats, the Christian part of that is really not, there's not much of that left anymore. But at one time, they were called that because of actually their very devout Christian beliefs. This was going back into the immediate years following World War II as they were trying to reorganize a government, and then through the 1950s and the like. But I could see it happening in this country, and we talk about the fact that we are so often disappointed. Don't put your faith in princes, obviously, but we talk about how we are so often disappointed by the way government moves. I think in the next few years, if this country does not come out of the economic malaise it has been in for nearly a decade, I can see more and more of these alternative parties popping up across the country. And especially as we get more and more polarized, where people, because of their traditional beliefs, are constantly threatened in their daily lives, they'll start to organize. And if they start winning seats in governments, you'll suddenly see a lot of people, typical politician on the other side, wetting an index finger, sticking it up in the air and seeing which way the wind is blowing. Happens all the time. And so once you get that political power, look, if you go into the inner cities of America, we were talking earlier about Baltimore, Maryland. The mayor is a black woman. The police chief or the commissioner is a black man. The president of the city council is a black man. Because what happened was these people organized at some point and decided that they needed a share of political power. If you go back into all of the major cities in these countries, or this country, and you look at what happened, for instance, with Irish immigrants, within a generation, a lot of them controlled most of the big city halls east of the Mississippi. It's just because they realized they had to band together, and I could see something like this happening with the launch of Christian parties across the country, and then all of a sudden you get a share of that power, and you can flex a little muscle, political muscle, and we can turn the tide on some of these things that currently are destroying this culture. I want to point out you can reach the program today if you're inclined. Give us a call at News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. 736-0300, the telephone number, and my email address, bill.colley at townsquaremedia.com. Last name is spelled Colley. Got to tell you quickly about an entirely different topic. I just happened to see this morning, just before I went on the air. ESPN is filing a lawsuit against Verizon. And I saw this in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. And the title is How Cable Lost the Remote. And they're talking about the Discovery Channel. The Discovery Channel has made so much money in the last few years. They have 2.9 million viewers for their highest rated show. Out of how many potential viewers nationwide? Well, you got 330 million people in this country. And yet, their profit margin has jumped billions and billions and billions of dollars in just a few years. Why? Because the cable company is charging you for stations that you don't watch. And then, peddling that, turning around, and they're basically making you eat the cost for all of this. Well, guess what has happened? A lot of these internet providers have realized you don't necessarily need cable TV anymore. Cable TV has never had any competition. I'm going to tell you right now, I did not sign up for cable TV when I moved into my new place. I'm still paying for I have a house in another state. So, maintaining two households is expensive, so I'm trying to keep some of those expenses down. I have discovered, though, I can pay for the internet, which I think is already outrageously priced, but I'm paying for the internet. I got a cable package way back less than 20 years ago for, I think it was 13 channels for $6 a month. Now, there's no way that inflationary costs have skyrocketed that much where you got to pay $90 a month for your cable, except that all of these premium channels or these cable channels are demanding these payouts, but no one wants to watch them. So now you've got a much better alternative on the computer just with the internet service. I find that I can see most everything that I want to see somewhere via videos on the internet. And I did go out and I spent $10 a month to get the MLB network, Major League Baseball network, which means I can watch any baseball game anywhere around the country whenever I want to, which eats up a lot of my spare time anyway. But that's a lot cheaper than paying $90 or more to a cable company so I can get 150 channels, of which I will watch maybe 6 or 7 at most on a regular basis. And it appears that the cable industry is suddenly starting to realize maybe they should have been nicer to the customers because competition is here now. And you know what? Revenge is a sweet thing. Bill Colley with you this morning, 49 at our studios, 20 minutes away from 10 o'clock. Got a couple of other things, too, I want to mention this morning before we wrap up. I'll tell you what, we'll hear from some fine sponsors, though, first. I mentioned tomorrow we're going to be scheduled to be joined for a few minutes by Brigitte Gabriel, who you may know from some of her television appearances, and she's written some books, and she runs an organization in this country to warn people about the dangers of Islam. She is speaking May 7th, that is a week from today, in Boise, which is why she's joining us tomorrow, just to promote her appearance, of course, coming up. They also have a national convention. Her organization is called ACT. That's an acronym. They have a national convention coming up in Washington during the week of September 11th this year. Here's something that we might want to run by her, because we keep being told, we don't have to worry about any of these issues. No. Just despite the fact that wherever Islamic populations grow around this world in non-Islamic lands, it's maybe only a generation before the real trouble starts. The headline at magicvalley.com, which of course is the website for a partner to a local newspaper run by some Marxist-Leninists here in Twin Falls. Here's the headline. I don't know if any of you have heard this. CSI Refugee Center expects influx of Syrians. Well, they're having a civil war there, plus they're being attacked by ISIS, so we've got to do something now, don't we, to make life much better for them. And so let's have them come here, and we'll spend lots of taxpayer dollars to find them homes, put them into those homes, and then they'll just integrate, and within a couple of generations, they'll be hanging out like everybody else at the soccer field, going to the basketball games, sipping a cold one. No, that won't happen now, will it? We have a caller with us. You're on the air with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Yes, Bill, I was just going to bring that up there. That CSI is bringing 300 of these over and stuff there, and we're going to be paying for their Medicare, food stamps, and housing twice. So we're going to be getting charged from CSIs on property taxes, and the government is taking it out of our money, and they're going to bring 300 of these people over here and try and look for jobs and stuff and what's available, and these 300 people are going to have the first chance to get the jobs.
Yeah.
And stuff. So they're going to be taken out of our pockets and overcrowding us over here. And before long, we're going to have the whole dang town full of.
Well, you know, they're going to be telling us if we oppose it that we're mean-spirited or that we're bigots. Just because we want to hang on to some of our own hard-earned money. And number two, because we want to protect the culture that pretty much has given this country the success it used to have.
Yes, and this with all these viruses coming around and stuff, they're dragging all this stuff over into our country, and we're going to be hurting really big in that. And it's not going to be much time before we're overrun to get over here.
I thank you much for the call. And you know what will happen this Sunday? If you do pick up a copy of the Times News, that is the old-fashioned newspaper, and I know not many people do that anymore, but if you pick up a copy of it this Sunday, there'll be a big editorial about how wonderful it is and all of the great things we can learn, and diversity makes us stronger. That's a liberal line. You always hear that. Diversity makes us stronger. I love the Pat Buchanan response to that. Where's your evidence? There is no evidence. It's just a buzz phrase that they use. Oh, our diversity makes us stronger. Really? When? Where? How about Baltimore, Maryland? How's that working out? How's it working out in Syria? How's it working out in London, England? How's it working out in Paris, France? Well, that's just a mean-spirited, bigoted thing you just said. So you'll have all of the touchy-feely folks over at the Times News this weekend writing about how wonderful this is and how opposition is just because we have a lot of knuckle-dragging, mean-spirited racists in this area. And yet Google came out with a map yesterday that shows southern Idaho especially is one of the least racist places in the country. In fact, there's hardly any serious racism west of the Mississippi River in this country. Most of it, get this, is in places like Rhode Island in liberal New England, or western Massachusetts in the People's Republic, or southern Vermont, or upstate New York, and down the spine of Appalachia. So here you go. They're going to try to tell us, well, you know, you don't want these people here. That's code word for your racism. No, we don't want our culture messed with. I'm sorry, we've had enough of this. And we don't want money continually taken out of our pockets. I'm sorry about what's happening to them in their part of the world. But you know what? You get the government you deserve. I've heard that line all the time in this country. And if they got a problem with what they're going through over there, maybe they should change their backward ways. Maybe that's what led to this in the first place. Coming up on 9:49, Bill Colley with you this morning. So, we're going to bring in hundreds and hundreds of them, settle them in the area. I know what part of town they'll go in. They'll get housing. It won't be great housing, but the slumlords will all profit handsomely from it, won't they? Yep. And you're not, they're out there. Believe me, I have been driving around some neighborhoods in this community. Yes, you have some beautiful places up on the north side and various other areas of town. But there are some neighborhoods in this, and I brought it up before, some neighborhoods in this city, I would not house a dog in some of these houses. And yet these refugees will be resettled there, and they'll pay top dollar. No, wait a minute. We'll pay top dollar for their rent. And the slumlord, oh, look at that. Big pile of money. Oh, here, I'll give a little to the politicians too. Bring more. Yeah, we can take a few more hundred of these people. Sure. Coming up on 10 minutes away from 10 o'clock. I just dropped my keyboard. Oh, rats. I hope it still works. I'll have to get a new one otherwise. They're a little unhappy with me for doing this on a daily basis. The Huckabee Report is brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls, 736-6563. I was just looking at we were talking about media and how, of course, they're so knee-jerk left in this country. There is a link on the Drudge Report. President Obama, he was with a school teacher who was named School Teacher of the Year, decided to take her to lunch. This was obviously planned in advance at a restaurant near the White House. Got inside, and there was a reporter in there and the reporter held up his cell phone and started videotaping the encounter. The president ordered the reporter to stop. Yes, boss. sorry, I upset you today. I won't be doing it any longer. What a bunch of wimps. Had George Bush asked, don't tape me. Ha! Who do you think you are, a dictator? We have freedom of the press here. Don't ever talk to me again like that, Mr. President. But when King Hussein Obama asks someone not to tape him, and the reporters all back down, and the other reporters apparently who were en masse following him in, all decided they would follow his instructions as well. What a great bunch of people these wimps are. And you know what? They know it. That's the other part of it. They write all of this liberal pap, but they can't understand, first of all, why no one bothers to read it any longer. But number two, I think deep down in, these were always the guys who got stuffed into lockers at schools, and they're just out for revenge. And they think that Republicans were responsible for sticking them in the lockers. You're up next with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Who, me?
Yes, you.
You know, I've been doing a lot of thinking. I'm retired. Our founding fathers really messed up in one important way when they formed our government, legislative, executive, judicial. There's no veto power over the Supreme Court. They treated the Supreme Court justices just like they were impartial little gods sitting up there. The people have no power over their decisions. That's wrong.
Well, you can always impeach a Supreme Court judge. So that was, I guess, the one possibility. The lifetime appointments were to try and ensure that we didn't try to influence them. Government didn't try to influence them by threatening to replace them every 5 years. I think that was, in its sense, a good idea. If you've got the ability to impeach these justices, it could happen. I mean, there have been justices who have been forced to walk away, even some nominees. Thanks for the call. Abe Fortas, just in the late 1960s, President Nixon wanted him on the court, and there were objections. Now, he didn't get there, but there would be an opportunity to remove a justice if that justice were playing so far beyond the pale that people said enough. So, yeah, there is at least that opportunity if it gets that far out of hand. 9:57. Two of those justices who are deciding this case, though, we should point out, two of those, Kagan and the other one might be Sotomayor, they have performed same-sex weddings in their roles as Supreme Court justices. How can they be impartial in this case? They aren't. That's obvious. Maybe they should recuse themselves and let the remaining, but see, they don't want to do that because if they did, they know the remaining 7 justices would obviously be voting against same-sex marriage. And they can't let that happen. 9:57 coming up on 9:58. Thank you for the call, too. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. As I mentioned earlier, Brigitte Gabriel, or Brigitte as she calls herself, it's a French pronunciation from her childhood in Lebanon, scheduled to join us tomorrow on the program. She'll spend about 10-15 minutes with us. She's making an appearance next week in Boise. And I think there's a lot of concern among people in Idaho that the growing numbers of the Islamic population, which is a trickle now but could become a torrent, could definitely change the culture here. And people who are happy with the way things are do, I think, have a legitimate gripe. She's expected to join us just after the 8:40 break tomorrow. So about 8:44, 8:45 in the morning. God willing, the creek don't rise. I'm here to talk to her tomorrow. In the meantime, Rush Limbaugh coming up, following news from Fox at 10 o'clock. Sean Hannity following 1 o'clock news from Fox, and Glenn Beck after the 4 o'clock news from Fox. Hope you can stick around for all of that, too.